Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next in the UK and Change Europe series of lunch hours. I'm delighted that we've brought back together our economics panel to digest the budget. Please, if you're watching on Slido, stick your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to them as many as possible. I really want to get through your questions as much as possible today, so A, stick them on there. B, vote for the ones you want me to pose to the panel. The panel will be familiar to all of you. We've got, in the order they appear on my screen, Jonathan Portes from King's College, UK and Changing Europe, Ben Chu from the BBC, Gemma Tetlow from the IFG, and Jill Rutter from the IFG and UK in a Changing Europe. And we'll kick off, as always, with a sort of relatively straightforward starter for 10, which is, if I was to say to you, good Lord, what were your two key takeaways from the budget? What would you say Ben? Excellent, a volunteer.
Yes, after Jill's klaxon, I have to find my own klaxon. And my klaxon would be that my first takeaway, that it was big, very big on tax, very big on spending, pretty big on borrowing. And my second takeaway would be that it could get bigger still. Looking at the guts of the envelope for public spending beyond 2025-26, it looks pretty tight, even though Rachel Reeves is spending a lot more on public services. There's still implied austerity for unprotected departments, presuming they spend what we think they are very likely to spend on health and education and childcare and other things like that. So it may be, unless growth comes to the rescue, and the OBR doesn't think it will, but it might. But if it doesn't, it might be that she has to come back for more tax rises to prevent further cuts on those unprotected departments, which I think are just as unrealistic as they were when they were penciled in by the previous government. So those are my two big takeaways.
Wonderful. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Don't all rush at once.
I'm happy to. So my takeaways were that, this budget has a very clear storyline and a strategy to me. It's short term, we're putting up taxes and putting that extra money into public services, especially the NHS, but also things like justice. And medium to long term, we're borrowing and putting that money into investment to generate growth and productivity improvements over the medium to long term. And it seems to me that is absolutely the right strategy because, I think the public clearly wants better services in the short term, and we all know that we need higher growth in the medium to long term. But it's also a gamble because it relies crucially on being able to actually deliver those improvements. That is, translating that extra money into improved public service quality, especially improved delivery in the NHS in the short term, and translating that investment into higher growth in the medium to long term. So actually getting that money spent and spent efficiently and effectively and improving the country's infrastructure and so on. And both of those, particularly given how, the recent record of the British state in sort of delivering improvements to public services and infrastructure, though that's delivery is going to be pretty challenging. So I think it's something of a gamble, but I think it's clearly the right gamble. It is the right strategy.
Gemma?
So a couple of things not been mentioned already. I think there were some important changes made to the fiscal rules yesterday. Some of those are very good, including things like targeting things 3 years out rather than 5 years out to try and get away from some of the gaming. I think many of those changes suggest a sort of more greater seriousness to a commitment to fiscal sustainability. Having said that, Rachel Reeves has kept very low headroom against these targets, similar to Jeremy Hunt, which means that things could easily get thrown off course by a forecast revision. But also means that, and she's also spent a lot of the extra headroom on public investment, but that makes it really important they do follow through with putting what they described as guardrails around public investment to make sure that money is actually well spent and delivers on, as Jonathan said, the kind of bet that higher public investment can improve public services and drive stronger growth in the long run, but that will only happen if it's well spent.
Jill?
Yes, I think my big takeaway is that for all that the Rachel Reeves equivalent of my father was a toolmaker is I was an economist at the Bank of England, this seems to me a sort of very political rather than economic budget. And I thought it was quite striking and maybe a bit disappointing that she didn't seem to have any underlying strategy on tax reform, other than I will just pick up money wherever I can and vaguely square it with the commitments that we made in the manifesto. There wasn't a sort of driving sense that she actually thought that tax was a potential lever she could be using, even within a sort of, fiscally neutral envelope, to improve the performance of the economy. And I think the other thing that's really, really interesting and to flag as a risk is that, okay, maybe she closes down loads of coffee shops and fast food outlets, certainly around where we are at King's. If 3 or 4 of them went, we'd still be left with another 5 or 6 within 2 minutes walk. So maybe that's not tragic, and those people would be released to do other, maybe more productive jobs into a slightly labour constrained economy, or retrainers, in green skills, construction, high-end business services, or whatever the vision for the economy is. But I think she's left herself a massive problem on social care, where the social care sector is already fragile. It's being hit. Jonathan will give us the figures on the decline in visa applications by tightening the rules there. And a lot of those small care providers, some of them may get out because of this increase in the employment allowance, but you'd have thought that that's a sector that isn't being shielded like the NHS is from the employer NICs increase. And this will dramatically put up costs, and we may see quite a lot of those slightly precarious businesses going out of business. And every time a care home goes out of business, that's personally very difficult for the people involved, but it's also very, very bad publicity for the government.
Jonathan, do you want to come in on that, on what Jill was saying about the social care sector and difficulties?
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, in some ways, the employer NICs increase could have been targeted on the social care sector, because combined with the minimum wage increase, you're pushing up the costs of employing people in that sector quite a bit. Most social care providers are not small enough to benefit hugely from the employment allowance, but they're not big enough and not resilient enough necessarily to be able to take such a significant increase in costs, because their funding stream ultimately comes from local authorities and or people who pay for their care. So I think combining that with, as Jill said, this really remarkable drop-off in visa applications for the social care sector, reducing labour supply, I think one way or another, the government is going to have to find some way of pumping significantly more money into social care to avert a really serious crunch, which would both be, I think, damaging for the people affected, but also, of course, have further knock-on impacts on the NHS. I think there was some money for local authorities in the budget yesterday for social care, but I suspect it won't be enough.
Am I right in saying that social care is one of the few areas where there isn't a review going to be that's been announced? I mean, they haven't announced anything at all, have they?
Nothing's announced so far, but on the Today programme, I think when Wes Streeting was doing his outing the day before the budget, when all the news was about the big injection into the NHS, Wes Streeting was saying that he very much wanted some sort of cross-party consensus around, but it seemed to be around his idea of the National Care Service. So I'd like you all to agree with me that a National Care Service would be the right way forward. And I'm not sure he'll necessarily get that. But what we haven't seen is any sort of process kicked off to do that, unlike in other areas where we, last week had the David Gauke review of sentencing, the John Cunliffe review of the water industry. So we've heard some early indications that Wes Streeting might be attracted to a royal commission, but no moves at all that we've seen to set that up. I thought that we might actually get an announcement about that in the budget, because it seemed to be an area that did need filling, that they should start thinking about that. The one thing Streeting did say was that he thought there should be a 10-year plan for social care. to go alongside the 10-year plan that we'll get next spring for the NHS, and which the government's already consulting on, and I think getting lots of helpful comments from members of the public.
I mean, it's worth saying we've just had a question in about it, and it goes back to what Jonathan said, that, I mean, most people agree that actually, if you're going to get real productivity increases and results in the NHS, you're going to have to do something about social care. So it's not social care just by itself, but it impacts on the NHS, doesn't it? You can all just nod sagely if you want at that. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and it may be that the government just regards the NHS as the umbrella way of saying that. So we'll have to see actually how they use this money. And I think there's a really interesting question with that scale of injection into the NHS is, how do you make sure you actually spend that sensibly? I think there's a bit of a feeling with some of the Gordon Brown injections of cash in the early 2000s that quite a lot of it sort of went into pay. Well, maybe that's okay, maybe whatever. But as Jonathan said, the absolutely critical thing for the government is going to be that people see material service improvements as a result of the extra money going in.
Okay, and just while we're on this issue, we've got a question in from Sandy saying, do you think the rise in the carers allowance might help reduce demand for residential social care?
Not much, I think, is the answer. Very marginal. I mean, it's a good thing. It will make a relatively small numbers of people's lives considerably easier, and that's a good thing. But I don't think, in terms of actually reducing demand, I suspect the impact is pretty marginal.
Okay. Jill, just to come back to what you said it was a very political budget. Do you want to just flesh that out a bit? I mean, did you just simply mean by that there were lots of economic issues that weren't tackled, or do you mean it in a more sort of broadly rewarding our followers? And
I think so. There were some touches that I have to say I rather winced at, like the 1 pence off draft beer or whatever. I mean, try and spot whether that's passed on with all the extra costs that pubs will clearly be bearing in terms of minimum wage and employer nicks and things like that. I'd be very interested if anyone can go on a hunt for 1 pence off that. I don't drink the stuff myself, so I won't notice. But will the cost of the round you buy at farewell round of drinks in the pub tonight go down? Really? I don't think so. I mean, we've already had the RAC saying the 5 pence cut in fuel duty wasn't passed on, and things like that. I thought the decision on fuel duty, again, odd, but I mean, it was also the sort of way in which you had to do, if you're going to basically say it's all much worse, she could have gone back and said, it's all so much worse than we expected. I'm going to have to really break some of those big promises that I made on better taxes. And those are better taxes to raise than this really odd employer's national insurance contribution, which is going to further drive the sort of, incentives to become self-employed and things like that. And that wedge, which we saw Philip Hammond a few years ago trying to close. So it just seems sort of that this clearly went down incredibly well on the backbenches. We hear she got a great reception last night at the Parliamentary Labour Party. It hit quite a lot of party buttons, but it was both the way in which she went around her tax increases, but also the fact that we got a corporate tax roadmap, which doesn't seem to enormously consist of much more than saying, I'm not going to put up corporation tax and I'll keep full expensing, but I haven't been into the detail on that. Gemma or Ben may correct me there. We didn't get any, we were told we get something on reform of business rates, but we got a slight rejigging of business rates. That didn't seem to look like a sort of big reform system. And she didn't identify or indeed put any of her other tax changes into a reform narrative. I mean, it was not this is about making the tax system better. This is about, these are people I think are relatively soft targets to go after that are squareable with our manifesto pledges, and I will do that. And of course, we got the absolutely eternal, let's close the tax gap a bit more, I'll employ some more HMRC officials, and I will match that also by cracking down on welfare fraud. So we'll see how much those actually end up yielding. So it struck me that she could have been talking about, we need a capital tax regime that's fit for the 21st century. I'm actually determined to look long-term at property taxes. But no, what did she do? She ended the holiday on stamp duty, for at the lower end, and then she just slaps another couple of % on second homes, because they're quite easy to go after as well. And that's what people like you and your Oxford professor friends, Anand, rather than working people.
Are you glad you got that off your chest now? Gemma?
I agree with Jill on tax. It didn't feel like there was a huge amount of big picture strategy there, and certainly on capital taxes, many people were trying to encourage a more serious overhaul of capital taxes, which they didn't go anywhere near. They just increased capital gains tax rates on the margin. I think on some of the spending announcements, it felt less the word in the sense that a big part of the spending increase and a big part of their sort of bet was putting more money into public investment and sort of expecting that will increase growth in the longer term. But that's something that the OBR doesn't expect is going to show up as a positive on growth until well into the next parliament. And so I think that did signal a bit of a shift away from quite a cynical short-term approach on public spending, which we've had in recent years, where government's been very obsessed with what scores in the next 5-year forecast that the OBR produces. So I think there was, in some of those areas, a slightly longer-term focus, which perhaps is slightly less geared towards being the thing that's definitely going to get you elected in the short term.
I mean, I agree with that. There was much, in the last few budgets, it's been very easy to look at things and say, this is a really, really stupid decision that has been taken purely because of the government's desire to pretend that it was meeting the fiscal rules. So literally the Treasury pushing back spending projects, even when we knew full well that would make them more expensive and less useful, simply in order to shift the money around the spreadsheets. And I know in some sense this is a sort of low bar. It's a sort of, you wouldn't expect, you would hope that the average sort of small business owner wouldn't behave this way. So it's a bit of a low bar to congratulate the Treasury and the government for not behaving in this absolutely idiotic and damaging way. But that didn't appear to be what they were doing yesterday, and I think we should at least give one cheer for that.
Ben, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just to add on the tax side to what's been said, I did sense a very political hand in the decision not to freeze income tax thresholds, because that was an odd one, because that had been pretty heavily briefed out that they were going to do that and raise a considerable chunk of money. I think about £7 billion was the figure that had been put about, and then she theatrically said in the budget, I've been asked to do this, never thought it was coming, but I'm not going to do it. And I think that does feel like something where they thought, we'll get plaudits for this. This is a political decision, because if the choice is on the margin between raising it from employers' national insurance or through, it's not ideal obviously to raise it through freezing thresholds, but it's another way of doing it. I think most economists would say it's better to just do it through income tax because it's less distortionary. And I felt that was something where they probably made that decision quite possibly late in the day for political reasons. And of course, as Jill mentioned, that perennial fuel duty nonsense, really hoping that they wouldn't do it, but it looks like they just capitulated to the politics of the Sun front page. Not that it did them much good, not that it ever really does them necessarily that much good, but that was very, very depressing to see that continuity. One final thing, her leaving so little headroom. I think a lot of people hoped that she wouldn't just have a little nubbin of headroom against her fiscal rules like her predecessors did. But again, that was one element of continuity, wasn't it? Just basically a hair's breadth of leeway, which could easily be wiped up by a tiny rise in interest rates or a tiny shortfall in growth.
And what was interesting there, and Gemma knows much more about this than me, was that we thought this change in the fiscal rules was going to give her much more space to do things, and then it didn't seem to give her quite as much space. But I think Gemma knows more about this than I do.
Yes, I think because people have in advance have been talking about how much extra headroom shifting a measure might give you, and bigger numbers have been thrown around than actually seemed to be the case in the numbers yesterday. It turns out that actually this seems to be partly because the OBR had made a mistake in their March forecasts for snuffle, so it wasn't actually coming down as quickly as they suggested in March, and so they basically had to restate their past forecast in their latest budget, which is a bit unfortunate. In a way, it's one of those things that I wonder whether, presumably, they were aware of this in recent weeks when they revisited the forecast, and might have been helpful to the public debate if actually they'd corrected the error in their previous forecast when people were going around before the budget saying, oh, they're going to have £50 billion to spend. But yes, there was basically an error in the previous forecast.
Just one last thing on the politics. Is it fair to say it is genuinely quite hard to square this budget with the sorts of things they said during the election campaign about what they would do? Or is that overly cynical?
I think the announcements yesterday were very different from, certainly the letter, maybe not quite the spirit of the Labour manifesto, but the letter of the Labour manifesto said they were basically planning to stick with the previous government spending plans and have limited tax increases amounting to £7 billion. And yesterday's announcement was vastly different from that. I mean, I think to add context to that, I think it was an inevitable result of the fact that those previous spending plans were totally implausible. And both main parties went into the election basically making a promise on public service quality that was not at all consistent with the spending plans they claimed they'd deliver on. So I think at least we've kind of had a recognition of the reality that was always going to have to come out. But yes, it was quite different from the letter of what they put in the manifesto.
I suppose it means Paul Johnson
you can say that the £22 billion black hole is doing a lot of rhetorical work in Labour trying to square the circle with what they said before the election and what they have done this week, put it that way. The OBR are not endorsing that figure, saying it's probably more like 10 billion. I think, even if there was an overspend, which there clearly was, the gap between that overspend and what they've actually done this week is too big, pretty clear, rightly or wrongly.
Now, a few of you have touched on the sort of lack of a tax strategy. I just wonder whether you're not being slightly unfair. I mean, when's the last time a chancellor stood up in a budget and said, I'm going to have a serious strategic look at tax and reform the system? I mean, is any chancellor ever going to be in a position to do that? I mean, these things are by nature relatively short term and also very political rather than looking at the well-being of the system, aren't they?
Well, yes, but I mean, it did happen under Nigel Lawson, of course. And, yes, you need political will. You need to have the backing of your prime minister. And you need to be able to prepare to take some short-term hits because you're going to rationalizing the system means that you will get some losers. But it's not impossible. There's no God-given rule that says we have to have a tax system that becomes more and more complicated, more and more irrational, and more sort of oddities around the edges that at the margin are bad for growth and provide disincentives to doing otherwise sensible things. And you could. It would not be politically impossible to sort out the high rates of marginal tax between 100 and 150,000 that arise as a result of the combination of the personal allowance withdrawal, the way we treat childcare and the child benefit things. You just say, right, these are all really, really stupid. These people can afford it, so we're going to tax some of them a bit more by putting up the higher rate of tax and tax some of them a bit less by smoothing this off. And yes, there'll be some winners and losers, but they'll just have to lump it. And yes, we're breaking the letter of some promise, but we're not really breaking it because we're not increasing the tax burden overall on this group. And that would be sensible, sane, fair, and economically efficient. You could do all of that. It would not be hugely costly politically. You get some bad headlines in the Telegraph, but the Telegraph is already claiming that this is the worst thing since the bubonic plague. So I'm not sure what more you have to lose.
I mean, if you seriously want a much bigger state, and we do seem to have, some of the striking figures in the OBR assessment that, now we've basically increased the size of public spending by about 5 percentage points GDP compared to the pre-pandemic level. So if you want that, then you actually owe it to the country to raise that money in a sort of very sensible way, which does minimum to impede, if you like, the economic performance. And if you pride yourself on being an economist, you should care about that. She's got a majority of 200 or so, which is why, appearing to be in hock to the sort of, what we thought before, the Conservatives probably in the last, couldn't probably get through a fuel duty increase, certainly when Theresa May was Prime Minister, they'd lost their majority and they're on that. But Rachel Reeves, I think, would have had the political will to political things if she'd wanted to do that. And chancellors ask their other colleagues to do much harder stuff and to effectively take much bigger sums away from people than the sort of numbers Jonathan, Gemma are talking about to do sort of tax reform. And if you think about things like, for example, we don't call it a tax, but the introduction of student fees. I mean, that's taking serious amounts of money away long term from a very specific group of people. But the Treasury is very willing to get other departments to do it, but then sort of hides behind the sofa when it comes to them doing any serious reform. So I think, we should demand a bit more from a chancellor, particularly one who prides herself on her economic credentials. George Osborne never pretended to have any economic credentials, so our expectations would be quite a lot lower.
Gemma?
I was just going to say, I agree. I mean, you're right that we haven't had many previous chancellors who've had serious tax strategies or been willing to take serious risks to improve the tax system. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep hoping and expecting that a future chancellor will, because there are many well-known problems in the tax system. I think one of the things that I slightly had to sigh at in the speech was when Rachel Reeves came to talking about business asset disposal relief, the fantastically acronymed BAD relief, which gives relief on capital gains tax for the first £1 million of money from your own company when you sell it. She talked about the fact that she wanted to retain the incentive to people to invest in their own businesses. There is good evaluation evidence on that policy as it has changed over time, which shows no evidence that it encourages people to invest in their business. What it does do is encourage people to retain cash in their business until they sell it and then can benefit from low rates of tax on it rather than taking the money out as income earlier on. I had to sigh a bit at a chancellor who is a trained economist, should understand the evidence, actually perpetuating a myth that a part of the tax system is having an effect that it really isn't. And yes, we do want to encourage investment in businesses, but we should have taxes that genuinely do that rather than ones that we pretend do that.
Okay, we've got a load of questions coming in now. I mean, one of the really interesting one is about inflation. So the OBR is projecting that inflation will be slightly higher in the near term. Are we expecting that interest rates, therefore, are going to be slightly higher going forward than they would have been? And does that matter politically, I suppose, first and foremost?
I mean, so yes and yes is the answer. So the OBR thinks that the government's announcements, which involve quite a lot of extra borrowing and spending in the near term, particularly, are going to push the economy above its potential output, so have a positive output gap, which is putting upward pressure on prices and inflation. That combined with extra public borrowing, they think will tend to push up interest rates compared to where they would have been, which they think is going to drag on private sector investment in the near term as well. So yes, there is that dynamic going on that the Bank of England will be somewhat offsetting the stimulus effect that's coming from fiscal policy in the next few years. Ben may have thoughts on the kind of the politics of this and how it plays with households.
Ben?
Yeah, I was actually going to make a point on the economics. Obviously, it's dependent on what the Bank of England thinks about the economy, not what the OBR thinks will be the impact of the budget as well. And they may have a different view of the amount of slack in the economy from the OBR. So as Richard Hughes was keen to point out, the decision will be the Bank of England's, not the OBR's. So let's see what the Bank of England says. And in terms of the what the Bank of England thinks, so it was striking that the OBR showed the Bank of England's growth forecast next to its own, and the Bank of England is still much more pessimistic about the growth potential of the UK economy in its August outlook than the OBR is now, and Bank of England is even more pessimistic than the average of outside forecasters. So that would imply I don't know. I can't remember what exactly the output gap estimate is from the Bank of England. But if you get a big fiscal stimulus when they've got a lower trend growth, it would imply that they maybe think there's even more inflationary pressure than otherwise, and they may be even slower to lower interest rates than they otherwise would be. We'll have to wait and see. But I think it is important to recognise that there are different forecasters out there. And their views matter. And I think there is a slight danger that people think that the OBR is the only game in town, and that's how it's treated sometimes in interviews when it's not the case. In terms of the political impact, look, I think there is it obviously matters what's happening to mortgage rates. Whether it matters quite as much as some of the headlines suggest in people's sense of well-being or not, relative to other factors like income growth, you can debate it. I think there's fewer owner-occupiers who are tied to variable rates these days than there used to be, so maybe it's not a big thing. But it is striking, again, looking at the OBR's estimates of what's going to happen to household incomes over this parliament. I mean, if you thought the last one was bad, this really isn't much better. That doesn't bode well if that materialises. They're obviously only forecasts, so we'll see.
Yeah, and remember, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and basically, we're talking about interest rates being maybe 0.25% higher than they otherwise would have been. I mean, they'll come down by 1% rather than 1.25%. This is all so far within the margin of error, and the truth is, as of course we know, it's not only that forecasters differ; it's just that all forecasts are wrong, and in recent years have been wrong by quite a bit. This is not to blame forecasters. It's because the world is an inherently uncertain place. What happens in America on Tuesday could have really quite a lot bigger effects than, whether the Bank of England decides to put up interest rates down by 0.25%. If Trump really does triple tariffs on the rest of the world, you're going to see some quite big impacts here, and that has got nothing to do with the Treasury, the Bank of England, or the OBR. Not to mention what happens in the Middle East.
I mean, we do seem quite. Do you want to add anything on this, Jill? I mean, we've got a few questions about the green transition. A lot of them sort of focusing on the sort of raising of the bus fare cap and the continuation of the freeze on fuel duty. Should we read anything into that about the politics of this government when it comes to the green transition?
I personally think that it's an odd set of decisions, not particularly on green transition front, but if it had been me, I wouldn't have frozen fuel duty, and I probably wouldn't have frozen it for the past decade and a half. So I'm probably in a slightly different position. Indeed, when I was at the Treasury, we were all very singing the praise of the fuel duty escalator, which we thought was supposed to be a green transition signal even back then, that you should buy a more fuel efficient car, because the only way in which fuel duties and fuel prices were going to go was up. I would just note that fuel prices are relatively low at the moment because of the fall in underlying oil prices. And it seems very weird, if you were looking at fiscal choices, that the Chancellor didn't decide to just put a penny or 2 pennies on fuel duty and use that to pay for maintaining the bus fare cap at £2, or just putting it up to something like £2.25, which you would have thought, to somebody who is dependent on buses and uses them a lot to get to work, to face a 50% increase potentially overnight is actually quite a big hit, I would have said. So I thought that was just a bit odd. I think, clearly Ed Miliband did quite well out of some of the capital spending in this state, which is the more important side of the green transition. But I think some of the one of the things that I think is quite interesting is where's the government deciding to put its money on the green transition, because it's probably choosing the things that environmentalists like least. We obviously had a successful offshore wind auction in September, which was a rerun, if you like, of the ones the Conservatives had, and they did manage to get a lot of contracts away that time by upping the amount they were prepared to pay for that. But we've had a big announcement on carbon capture and storage with jobs in Merseyside and on Teesside.
Yeah.
And now we have investment in green hydrogen, which I think, Ben may have views on this, or Gemma or Jonathan, but green hydrogen is regarded as sort of, a bit of a last resort, I think, to help with reducing industrial emissions. We also saw a bit, and frankly, if I'd been Rachel Reeves, I would have made more about this, and I would have possibly also linked it, but maybe she didn't want to mention it, to her winter fuel allowance decision about sort of revving up the sort of warm homes scheme, which I think is an important part of the journey, and I think I would have made rather more of that. So I think it's quite interesting where they're going and where they're actually putting their money that they've got. But we have the National Wealth Fund that'll make its own decisions. We have GB Energy under Jürgen Meyer that'll make its own decisions. And I think, if I'm right, looks at Gemma, Ben and Jonathan, because they're the proper economists here, I think the decision to move to public sector net financial liabilities means that the National Wealth Fund and GB Energy can take stakes in things or invest and won't be constrained by borrowing. Is that right on those two things by the change in the debt rule?
Yes. So the difference with this debt rule is that it also captures long-term financial assets. So I think pretty much everything that would be done through the National Wealth Fund, UK Infrastructure Bank, GB Energy, anything that structures a kind of financial stake in something would be netted off this new target measure of debt in a way that it wasn't. I think that creates a sort of question and something to monitor with the government going forward, is there's clearly now an incentive for government to channel its investment through those sorts of vehicles rather than investing directly. And we've got to hope that they do that for the right reasons rather than just because it keeps it off their measure of liabilities.
Let me just take this opportunity to plug Stephen Hunsacker's work on what we used to get out of the European Investment Bank, which is something we never ever seem to talk about, but actually the difference in scale between what we were getting then and what the national equivalents we have now are putting into the economy is quite eye-watering. And of course, the European Investment Bank managed to do these at very low rates because it had such a good credit rating. But Jonathan, did you want to add anything on the green agenda and what you...
Actually, can I also plug something which I found immensely interesting, which is there's a very good expert factor on national wealth funds, which actually looks at things like these sort of development banks, the stuff Stephen looks at in his work. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And the UK is not alone in keeping those off the, if you like, the public sector balance sheet. That seems to be relatively standard practice for, things like, I don't know, it's Credit Anstalt for Vida Alpha.
Oh, you've muted yourself, Jill. You muted yourself in mid-flow. That wasn't me, I promise.
I'm unmuted, but anyway, I just thought the expert factor on national wealth funds was really interesting. Not even sure you were on it, but it was.
I'd just like to say, Jill only plugs the episodes I'm not on, which is very sweet. But Jonathan, did you?
No, I mean, I agree with Elvis. I mean, the key, obviously, is that you have that if you're going to count these as assets, and you should. You have to you have to get the investment right. You have to invest in things that actually generate a return, and that is not always easy for governments for all sorts of reasons, both structural and political. So it'll be a real test as to whether, in 10 years' time, we look at the National Wealth Fund and think, well, actually, that did a good job of investing our money, or look at it and say, oh dear, that was, the incentives that created end up in us throwing a lot of money down the drain.
And when it comes to spending, actually, we're planning to spend an awful lot quite quickly in areas like the NHS, aren't we? And it does seem to me that, the big question is how it's spent. I mean, there's a big open-ended question there, isn't there?
Well, that's right, and we talked about some of the money, the big increases in spending in the 2000s on the NHS and other things did go into higher pay and maybe weren't spent as efficiently as they could have been. On the other hand, waiting when after a couple of years the government started to get a grip and to drive progress in the NHS, we did see very significant falls in waiting lists and very significant rises in patient satisfaction. The NHS genuinely got a lot better. Now, of course, the challenges today are very different. So it's not that you can just do the same thing, but it is possible for governments to spend the money well, but it's not easy. And I do think that this is, in the short term, this is really by far the most important challenge. We are putting a lot, the reason real household disposable income is not going to go up very, very much in this parliament, as Ben said, is because the government is taking it away, taking money out of private spending and putting it into public spending. It is taking money out of our pockets and businesses' pockets and putting it into the NHS and other things. And my view is actually, and as Ben said, we are they are effectively sort of breaking some of their, at least the letter of their manifesto promises in doing that. But I do think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that is broadly what the public wants. And if the result is actually substantial improvements in public service, an NHS that actually works, I, for one, am happy to pay more tax if the next time when I took my mum to UCL with a hip fracture, we waited in A&E for 8 to 10 hours. And of course, and we were lucky. If that stops happening, I think people will forgive both the increased taxes and the dishonesty about the manifesto and say that was a price worth paying. If, however, we pay higher taxes and we don't get results in terms of that delivery of public services, then nobody is going to be happy.
On the question of making sure the money is well spent on the capital side, the government is bringing forward this new body called NISTA, which is designed to ensure that. So we all obviously have to hope that is a success for all the reasons that Jonathan outlines, and we need to scrutinize that probably a lot more than we have been. Rather than just looking at the figures, we've got to look at, as he says, where is this money going? How effectively is it being spent? That needs to be a kind of priority, I think, given how sustained this rise in capital expenditure that the government's pledging will be and how important it is. I think as a coder as well, it is worth raising an eyebrow at the £28 billion hokey cokey from Labour. Remember when they had that as their green capital investment, and they said, no, we're basically getting rid of that, and it's all going to come from the private sector, and we're going to encourage it. And now, lo and behold, they've got in. And if you look at the difference between what the plan was in terms of capital spending and what the new plan is, by the end of the parliament, it adds up to £28 billion. So it's gone, it's back again. I mean, that's not all going to be on green spending, but it is quite striking that the exact figure seems to have rematerialized.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. I'm going to read out this question from Mady, not because I expect you to answer it, but because I think it's such a good question. Will this budget help Labour win the next election? Now, it's far, far too soon to tell, I'm afraid. I think Mady is the, unless anyone wants to offer an opinion, my hunch is that it's far too soon to tell. But it did strike me as a question that would have been in the minds of some people drafting this budget, because it is, I mean, it is key to this parliament, isn't it? I mean, that's one of the things that's so important about this budget, is it basically sets a roadmap for the whole parliament, doesn't it?
I mean, you can see why Rachel Reeves thinks or hopes that it will, get the pain out of the way early of the tax rises, get some improvement in public services, as Jonathan said, so people actually feel it and are happy with it and weigh that up and value it more than the fact of the tax rises. And also maybe the OBR will be wrong and maybe you'll get some decent growth towards the end of the parliament. So I think that would be her calculation. And if that does all materialize, I'm sure she'll be hoping that is a good platform for the next election. But as she said, far too early to tell.
We've got a bunch of questions in about local government funding, about settlements for mayors. I suppose the broad question is, what lessons do you draw from this budget about the government's approach to the regions? Does it give you any hints about an ambition to devolve power, which they spoke about a lot in opposition? Are we anywhere nearer addressing the sort of funding crisis in local government? Any or all of those?
I think local government was one of the relative winners in the settlements for the next couple of years. So I think some sign there, and we heard confirmation that Greater Manchester and West Midlands would get a single settlement in the forthcoming multi-year spending review. So I think there were some signs on that. I think some of the more important information, I guess, about the government's approach will probably not be totally clear until we get the spending review settlement next year and see within that how far it's subnational government that's being expected to deliver on the government's ambitions and exactly what the sort of longer term spending settlements for different areas are. I don't think we saw anything yesterday that sort of fundamentally addressed the financial challenges of local government, which is coming from the inexorable rise in the pressure on adult and children's social care, and the fact that the tax base just doesn't match up to that at the moment.
I mean, totally unsurprisingly, we got nothing about reforming local government finance, but I suppose that really is far too much to hope for, which would be quite interesting, because that, I think, is one of the sort of longer run questions. But you do get the sense, but maybe the others don't agree, but you do slightly get the sense that we're becoming a sort of country with two very different systems of government, that if you're in a mayoralty, there's sort of one set of emerging rules for you. And if you're not, I know the government wants to extend its devolution deals and bring more people into that form of government, but it does seem a bit sort of two-tier. I think we had confirmation of the sort of, trailblazer settlements for Manchester and West Midlands if they met certain conditions and things like that. And elsewhere, you're still sort of, stuck with a sort of rather antiquated system. And as with a sort of local government finance system that increasingly looks unfit for purpose on so many levels, it's not true.
I mean, it does seem to me that the whole levelling up agenda has gone, hasn't it? I mean, actually, in general, there was very little talk either about that or about poverty in this budget for a Labour government, it struck me. Is that fair enough, do you think?
I think that's right. And on poverty, I mean, we're obviously expecting them to publish their child poverty strategy next year. I mean, yeah. I think in the DWP space yesterday, the only real announcements, I think, unless I missed something, was really around a focus on employment support programs and getting more people into work as a way of addressing living standards and inactivity. I imagine that's not the final word, and that more will come from the child poverty strategy and others about this government's approach to helping low-income households, because it seemed a notable gap from yesterday's announcements.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, they clearly did not want yesterday to have any talk about welfare benefits to either one way, either welfare cuts or welfare increases, and they seem to have largely got away with that. But the idea that you can have a meaningful strategy on child poverty that doesn't address the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, and local housing allowance, I think, is pie in the sky. And I assume the fact that they are, the child poverty strategy is talking to people, the various experts who do understand these topics, that is a signal that they do actually intend to do something meaningful on these when the child poverty strategy is published in due course. So I think there is certainly more to come on that.
Though they are promising significant welfare savings, aren't they? I mean, they're not specifying how.
Yeah, so that they're still signed up to the plans that Jeremy Hunt had set out for trying to quite significantly tackle the number of incapacity inactive people. So that is quite a challenge to deliver on the welfare forecasts and reduce those numbers relative to the underlying trend is quite a significant challenge.
Although,
go on, Jonathan.
I mean, it is, it isn't so much cutting people as it's sort of bending the curve on an underlying trend, which has got sort of hugely worse. So I do slightly wonder whether the OBR has somewhat overcooked the future forecast for that. Because the underlying, the trend that they have baked in was so bad that you sort of think, actually, if you just, that hopefully any sort of reasonably successful policies to deal with it should actually be able to make quite a bit of difference. And again, I think this is an area where the sort of things that they are talking about doing in terms of support actually do make sense. There is some evidence base behind them, and they do seem to be going in the right direction. So I'm slightly more optimistic on this, that maybe it's not quite as bad as it looks.
Okay. Ben, you look like you were going to come in.
No, I was just going to chip in and say, I think the OBR, from their own analysis, is heavily basing their projections on what's happened since the pandemic in disability and those things. So I suppose, as Jonathan says, it's possible that's a trend which will naturally peter out, which we must all obviously hope it does, because it is a very big part of the spending pressures.
And also, there's a labour market issue, isn't there, behind a lot of people not being in the workforce anymore. And actually, one of the things is the OBR sort of GDP growth figures beyond 2026 are a little bit anemic, aren't they? They're not great. Is that something that we should be worrying about now?
So they are pretty anemic. But on the other hand, the OBR also has what many people think is a quite optimistic assumption about productivity growth in the future, that it will return to 1.25% a year growth, which is certainly higher than it's been since the financial crisis.
Got to go up sometime.
So, well, yes, and I think they are sort of pointing to the fact that the US is seeing good productivity growth in some sectors where the UK also has quite a big GDP share and comparative advantage, things like professional services and life sciences and other areas. But I think just because the OBR's forecasts for UK growth look lower than perhaps we were used to pre-financial crisis doesn't mean that they're definitely too pessimistic. There's a lot, it could be worse than they think, as well as it could be better.
Anyone else on what we should make on the growth projections?
I mean, there are one or two areas where obviously they could have some sort of upside, what the OBR is determined to call risks, which I would have thought is a bit more positive than that. But one, for example, is if the government its planning reforms actually work and we actually see a significant increase in the number of housing starts, then the OBR says that could actually mean growth is higher. So I think one of the really interesting things, and I don't know whether the OBR has a diagnosis of this, maybe one of the others do, is
whether
the OBR does cause the UK actually to deliver 1.5% productivity growth or to increase productivity growth.
Anyone else got thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of the growth picture, I mean, obviously those forecasts from the OBRs are not great for a budget which is styled as a budget for growth, including the fact that it sort of detracts from growth by the end of the Parliament, although they did put in that chart, which was very useful and unusual for them to show that the investment spending that Rachel Reeves is doing will have a positive impact on the level of GDP in the next Parliament.
Yeah.
Look, I think in terms of the what's the main levers the government can pull to try and improve the UK economy's long-term growth rates? I don't know what Gemma and Jonathan and Jill would say, but my sense of the economic consensus is that, as Jonathan said at the start, she did do the right thing in terms of increasing investment spending. That is probably one of the top things, if not the top thing, that government can do to help the UK economy grow more rapidly in the future. And I think that's quite significant. She's put her money where her mouth is. And you asked earlier about where's levelling up, where's poverty reduction. Well, they've clearly prioritized in this budget and said we are going to put those things, we're not going to ignore them, we're not going to forget them, but we're going to put growth and public services front and center. And I think that's the big message that you get from this budget, and we'll see what happens.
Anyone got anything to add? Jonathan, you're muted.
I agree with Ben, and just, I mean, growth, the OBR doesn't know any more than anyone else about what the trend rate of growth is, or whether it will actually fall further or go back to something like the pre-financial crisis level or whatever, because of AI or something. We shouldn't pick over their forecasts, because they wouldn't claim that they're doing anything than making a sort of stylized assumption for the purposes of forecasting. And equally, criticizing the government because this budget lowers the level of expected output in 2028-29 according to the OBR model by 0.1% is frankly a waste of everybody's time. It's totally it means nothing in serious economic terms. The test is whether actually, as Ben said, whether the things that they're going to do help, along with everything else going on in the world economy and technology and so on, do help move the needle in a positive direction. And as Ben says, they put their money where their mouth is. Now they've got to turn that money into actually delivering.
Actually, while I've got you, Jonathan, for those who didn't know, Jonathan wrote a piece the day before the budget setting out his 5 tests for the budget. So actually, I haven't asked you about this. So go on then, score them on your 5 tests.
Well, I'll have to remember what my 5 tests were. For heaven's sake. Well, one test was the debt rule, and reforming it so as to put a big boost to long-term public investment, so she clearly succeeded in that one. That's good. On taxes, I said that they were going to sensibly put up taxes by a significant amount, and this was best could be hoped for. So she passed that, the first half of that test, but failed the second half, which was the issue we were talking about before about simplification. The third is about investment in infrastructure and in people. So certainly yes to the first. The second, I think, we don't know until we see more of the detail about departmental plans about where actually some of this additional money will be spent on. So we'll see that. Fourth, public services, money into the NHS, but crucially, meaningful plans to deliver improvements in productivity. And, you know, again, we won't know until a few months have gone whether they have that. So, and then finally, fairness. So doing something about child poverty, and that so far at least, you know, is a no. So on most of them, I think we've got a sort of yes, but only halfway there, because actually it's a lot of this is about the delivery and the detail, not about the allocations of money. It's the short answer. So far, mostly so good, but the hard bit starts now.
Okay. I mean, thinking back to when the government made its announcement on the winter fuel payments, a lot of people were saying this is politically naive. They should have stuck it in the budget. Then they could have had something that was countervailing. I mean, with the gift of hindsight, would it have made more sense to make that announcement yesterday rather than make it when they did? Or were they actually just trying to prove a point by doing it when they did?
My sense of when they did it was that they felt they needed to show they were serious about making tough decisions and making progress on cutting borrowing. I think it would have been an easier political sell to announce it yesterday in the budget alongside a lot of other things. It would have been a very small number and done at the same time as announcing we're going to raise billions of pounds more from high income, high wealth people through our changes to asset taxes, which I think would have been an easier sell than looking like you were singling out pensioners for cuts in the summer when no one else was seeing any pain. On the other hand, as Jonathan said, yesterday's budget very much steered clear of saying anything about welfare at all. So maybe putting in something on welfare cuts for pensioners would have raised the question about what are you doing on the rest of the welfare budget.
Okay.
And Rachel Reeves did mention that the effect of the triple lock was that pensioners were getting a much bigger increase than people on working age benefits, and she used the figure of £410 increase next April, which she could have set aside with the effect of removing the winter fuel allowance if you sort of brought those two things in together. And she also could have linked it through to the action on warmer homes that she announced. So I think she could have had a better package if she kept it then. And whether DWP logistics and when you need to start processing payments and stuff mean that would have been too late on the 30th of October. I don't know whether that was the advice that she'd given, but I think, you know, she made quite a big point about the sort of increase for pensioners and the increases they could expect versus the much less generous uprating based on the September inflation figure for working age benefit recipients. So I think she'd be in a stronger position if she'd done those all and explained a bit better why, and it wouldn't have stuck out. But I always thought it was a bit of an initiation ceremony for MPs, just to sort of shake out any more people who wanted to go off and get themselves suspended over failing to back tough decisions. So,
Go on, Ben.
No, I was just going to say I'm convinced by that, by Gemma and Jill's logic. I suppose it's still possible that had she announced it, we'd be talking about nothing else today, and it would be dominating the aftermath of the budget in a way that they wouldn't would have been bad for them as well. So who knows with these counterfactuals? But I broadly agree.
And one of the things we've heard a lot about in the run up to the budget was the need to reassure the markets because we're all a bit nervous after the sort of Liz Truss episode. Were the markets reassured? I mean, should she be pretty happy with how they responded in terms of gilts and the like?
Well, I think so far, yes. I mean, they were up about 4%, 4 basis points yesterday, which is when you look at the aftermath of the mini budget, it's just no comparison. I think they were up about 34 basis points, night and day. I mean, there was a little wobble in the afternoon, but nothing to really warrant some of the headlines and some of the things that were going around on social media about the market reaction is my take. But Jonathan will have a view as well, I'm sure.
I agree entirely. Absolutely right.
You're a boring bunch, aren't you? I mean, just watching the budget yesterday, I watched a bit of the speech yesterday, and in a sense, I found the whole thing just feels a bit odd now. You get all these leaks trailed for days, if not weeks before. She makes the speech, and the charts and tables on which the OBR have put out aren't available yet. I mean, it's just pantomime, isn't it? It's not the most effective way to make these kinds of announcements by any manner of means, is it? I know you lot all love it, but it just struck me this time as, God.
Well, the very good news is that Rachel Reeves claims that she's only going to have one really significant big fiscal event a year, which was a recommendation that Gemma and I certainly have been making quite often in the past. Other countries don't inflict multiple budgets on themselves outside normal circumstances. It's been a bit of a Gordon Brown thinking actually that chancellors didn't come out to play very often and didn't have enough times to get great publicity for what they were doing, so invented the pre-budget report that then sort of morphed into de facto a second budget, and one reason why we have quite so many budget measures. Mind you, if you look at the number of press releases from the Treasury issued yesterday, they do seem to have gone to town in a very big way. You do get the sense that we waited 14 years for a Labour Chancellor, or maybe 800 years for a woman Chancellor, and they have taken the opportunity to say quite a lot of things. It is a very odd event. I think Jonathan and I were just discussing the speaker's unhappiness about the way in which Rachel Reeves announced the change to the fiscal rules at the IMF autumn meetings in Washington, rather than to Parliament. Said that actually government could have quite easily put out some sort of document and given it to Parliament, and even if Rachel Reeves was in Washington, Darren Jones or someone could have just taken the House through what the government was thinking of doing. So I think it's interesting that at least some of us still tune in and sit through it, and that people like Ben clear the airwaves, get quite a big showing. It dominates the news. Though the BBC probably reverting as soon as possible to covering the US election, which they seem absolutely obsessed. And then we all look for what everybody says the day after. But hopefully, if Rachel Reeves really has made the big decisions now, future budgets will be less newsworthy.
Anyone else on the budget spectacle? We've run out of time, actually. So,
well, just a very quick note that I fear that the mini budget, which we were just talking about, and the aftermath of that, chancellors feel they have license to leak the entire contents, which they've always done to some extent, but even more so on the basis that you mustn't frighten the markets.
Yeah.
Basically pre-brief it out, and that's all okay. Never mind what the Speaker or Parliament think about it. It's all okay, and I can't see that changing, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Jonathan, Gemma, anything to add?
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think the idea that economists enjoy this is somewhat misplaced. I think we all find it, frankly, a bit silly sometimes, and sometimes positively damaging, because it detracts. It means that some decisions are taken too quickly without the proper analysis or consultation that might have avoided mistakes. And most other countries do not do this.
Well, you of all people, Jonathan, know I've got a very low opinion of economists, and that's never going to change. So there we are. But listen, on that note, let me thank you all. That was fascinating as always. I hope we can get you back together sort of in the spring to do this again. But I'm just so grateful to you for managing to explain all this stuff in a way that even I think I can understand, until someone asked me to repeat it a couple of days later, and then I realized I didn't understand it. But for the moment, I feel much better informed. So thank you all very much. Thanks for tuning in. Join us at our next event, which is, can't remember when, but it's either next week or the week after. And we'll see you all soon. Take care.